So speaking of Victorian women, spinsters were unhealthy. They were basically all considered mad, even though many eminent Victorian women never married, such as Florence Nightingale, the great reformer of the profession of nursing. She actually declined some proposals of marriage because she wanted to focus on her work. But perhaps for many doctors, like Dr. Acton, she would be considered abnormal. So, what about the other end of the spectrum? So, women who are having too much sex, the prostitutes. And here we go to the combined efforts of the medical, legal, and moral discourses in the way that the Victorians tried to limit the problem of prostitution, or as they called it, the great social vice. Of course, prostitution was rampant in Victorian society. There are different scholars and um, who believed how many women worked as prostitutes in the 19th century. The numbers differ. Sometimes they say that there was one prostitute per 12 men in the society, including very old and very young, and those who were actually faithful to their wives. So even if this number is not correct, the general rule is that probably never before and never again there were so many sex workers as in the Victorian society. The reasons for that we discussed a little bit last week. So the hypocrisy and the double standards, the belief that men should marry only when they had stable work situation so they were able to support the family. Of course, the unavailability and also the moral discourse against contraception or any means of limiting the size of the family. So, of course, after marriage, it was expected that women would start bearing children almost immediately. So, of course, men believed that they should marry their fiancés when they were able to support the family, possibly a big family. If you remember, the average number of children in the mid-Victorian and the high Victorian period was 5.5. So it was absolutely normal and expected of a family to have between 5 and 6 children, and then there were many families who had 10 or more. Uh, so this meant that the moral people, the middle class, the dominant social class people, married relatively late, in the later 20s, sometimes in the early 30s. And because it was socially expected for a bride from this class to be a virgin when she married, this left a lot of young, sexually frustrated men, and very many of them tried to find some sort of relief in contacting professional workers. So prostitution was absolutely rampant. This led to one very serious medical problem, and this one was actually real. That is the spread of venereal disease, especially syphilis. This was an uncurable disease. They didn't know antibiotics, they didn't have any effective cures for venereal diseases. So if you contracted such a disease, you could very likely have it until you died. And before It would ruin your body. It would lead you to madness, actually. Syphilis could do that. You could pass it, if you were a Victorian man, you could pass it to your unsuspecting wife. You could pass it on to your children. So this was a horrible disease. And because of the Victorian double standards and Victorian um, morality, this was a very big social problem, especially in the army. Because the situation in the army was such that ordinary soldiers, not speaking about officers, because officers could marry if they pleased, but ordinary soldiers could only marry legally, let's say, so-called on the roll. I'll tell you what it means in a moment. If they had the permission of their officers, if they married legally, it means that if the garrison was moved to another location, the family of the soldier would also be relocated, and the cost of relocation would be paid by the army. The wives of soldiers would get employment in the army, usually doing some sort of menial works, so cooking, washing clothes, and cleaning. So they would be like servants in the garrison, and if the garrison was relocated, the families of those soldiers would be relocated at the cost of the garrison. The problem was that the garrison did not need as many servants as there were soldiers. So only about 10%, perhaps 15% of soldiers got permission to marry on the roll. Those who did not get the permission, so they did not get the promise of employment for their future wives, could do two things. They could marry off the roll, so there was no law against soldiers having wives. But if the garrison was relocated, and this was quite common, that after a few years the soldiers would be relocated, the families, so the wives and the children, would not be relocated. So they would be separated from the husbands, or if the husbands could pay for the relocations, they could be relocated only then. Also, they could remain unmarried, so they could remain bachelors, and this meant that, of course, theoretically they should not be having any sexual relations, but in practice, most of them employed the services of prostitutes, and especially the garrison towns, so the towns that had an army facility and lost a big concentration of soldiers, had a big problem with prostitution. So the parliament noticed that there were so many cases of venereal diseases in the army. Some sources say that 1 in 3 sick cases in the British Army in the Victorian period was venereal disease. So, like 1 in 3, 1/3 of all cases of illness, any kind of illness, any kind of injury, was venereal disease. So this was a big problem. So the parliament passed a series of acts called the Contagious Diseases Acts. The first of such acts was passed in 1864, then there were some amendments, but within a few years in the 1860s, the Contagious Diseases Acts were passed to protect the health of the soldiers in garrison towns. And this was really a big problem, and right from the start, many people, including some very respectable Victorian women, such as Florence Nightingale, or another very important social reformer, Josephine Butler, started protesting in the press, or started campaigning for the repeal of these acts. Why would they do it? Why would respectable middle-class Victorian women want the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts that were to prevent the spread of syphilis in the army? Because how these acts were constructed. The idea was that in garrison towns and ports, any woman suspected of being a prostitute could be arrested by the police, taken to a medical station, and examined by a doctor. And if she was found to be infected with a venereal disease, she could be held in a hospital and treated. Sounds alright. But bear in mind this little fragment. Any woman suspected of being a prostitute, which means basically any poor woman walking alone, for whatever reason, or someone that the policeman didn't really like the look of, or this was the act of parliament that allowed systematic molestation of women on the grounds of some men's suspicion. And of course, as with many Victorian problems, this was the press that started noticing it first, and there were campaigns making the public aware of some drastic cases of the abuse of the new law. Some of the very drastic cases included, for example, situation like this. There was a poor widow who had small children, and one of the children fell ill at night. He had a high fever. So the woman left the children with some neighbors and ran out to find the doctor to treat the child. But she was seen as behaving irregularly in the street. So she was arrested by the policeman, taken to the medical station, examined against her will. Such examinations were very often compared to rape. In the words of the protesters. Of course, she was healthy. There was nothing wrong with her. Nobody listened to her explanations, but she was finally released in the morning. But when she found the doctor and brought the doctor back to her home, the child had already died. So this was, of course, a very drastic case, but these were situations that actually could happen, and many women who could be seen as moral and respectable by the Victorian society, such as this widow, but they just happened to be poor and they happened to need to go out alone, usually at night, could be harassed by the police, by the medical officers, and imprisoned even against their will. There was a massive campaign against the Contagious Diseases Acts and some important women. First of all, Josephine Butler, but also Florence Nightingale and other, well, not only women, but other social campaigners were involved in that. There was one thing they really wanted to make the public notice, is that prostitutes did not work in a vacuum. They all had clients, so it wasn't a female problem. It was a problem also concerning men, not only as victims of venereal disease, but also as agents of spreading the disease. And actually, it was the demand that created the problem of prostitution. And There were even some reformed prostitutes, so former prostitutes, that were interviewed by Josephine Butler, and what they all said was that their lives from very early age were completely dominated by men. There is one very famous press article which included the testimonial from one of such women, and this is what she said. It is men, only men, from the first to the last that I have to do with. To please a man I did wrong at first, when I was flung, and then I was flung from men to men. Men police lay hands on us. By men we are examined, handled, doctored. In the hospitals it is a man again who makes prayer and reads the Bible to us. We are held up before magistrates who are men, and we never get out of the hands of men until we die. So, for some of the later Victorian campaigners, uh, the problem was not really policing women who worked as prostitutes, but educating men, and especially young men, not to become the clients, to respect women, to control their sexual urges, and basically do not create the demand for the sexual trade. This was a long problem. So as I said, the Contagious Diseases Acts were passed in the 60s. They were only finally repealed in the 80s. So after 20 years of campaigning, and after the laws were repealed, of course, the problem of prostitution did not end completely, but at least this legal harassment of women ended, and the pressure groups, the groups such as Ladies National Association for the Repeal of the Contagious Diseases Act, and other social pressure groups moved from trying to influence the legislation to trying to educate young men. Wasn't very effective, but at least they tried, and at least they realized that the problem was not only the female problem. And we continue in a moment.